All right, welcome back, students. And in this section, part two, we'll be talking about Darwin's idea of natural selection as the mechanism for powering evolution. We'll talk about fitness, adaptations, that kind of stuff, and then we'll end up talking about the different pieces of evidence that scientists have to support this idea of natural selection as the mechanism that powers evolution. So let's get started. As you know, we talked about previously Darwin's journey on the Beagle and how he was impacted by all the different works of scientists such as Lamarck, Lyell Hutton, Malthus, and how it shaped his thinkings and his writings and led to the culmination of his work, which was his book here on the origin of the species, where he expounded his idea of evolution by natural selection, the idea of fitness, all that kind of stuff. And that's what we'll be looking at for the rest of this section. Darwin was all, like we mentioned before, impacted by several scientists, Malthus being one of the ones that was very significant, and it helped really clarify Darwin's view of this world as like a struggle for existence. This idea of competition, people, as Malthus had described, but in the case of Darwin, other organisms as well, fighting for these things here: food, living space, mates, territory, that kind of stuff. It exists in nature. Some organisms do it better than others, so they're more successful. Darwin also knew that individuals have variations amongst their traits. We talked about that in the previous section. Those variations occur through sexual reproduction, mutation, just the variations that are created during the process of meiosis. All those things that we talked about in previous units create variance within the population. Some variations are better than others for organisms in their environment, but characteristics that can be passed on, they're heritable, and increase an organism's ability to survive and reproduce are called adaptations. And a great example of that is the opposable thumb lab we did last week. Think about how important that thumb is. What an adaptation and an advantage it is for humans to have that thumb on the opposite side of the other fingers to enable us to do all the things that we can do and to manipulate all the things that we can and the type of dexterity we have. So Darwin recognized this. Some organisms have better variations than others. Those variations will make them do better in their environment. Those variations are called adaptations. Here's a couple of examples here: tiger claws, colors for camouflage, mimicry. These are all examples of adaptations. Anything that helps an organism survive better in its environment and is passed on from parent to offspring is an example of an adaptation. Here's a couple of examples: the king snake versus the coral snake. Coral snake, of course, venomous. King snake not, but the king snake looks like the coral snake. That's an example of mimicry. That's an adaptation that helps protect it. Look at this example here, the camouflage, another example of an adaptation, helping it blend in. If it doesn't get eaten, it did well. And if it looks like that, it survives, it will pass that trait on to its offspring. Behaviors, like for example, a crane opening up its feathers. Behaviors can also be examples of adaptations that are passed on to offspring. And this idea of adaptations, variations, these things that make organisms better than others, led to this concept that Darwin described as fitness. Fitness, basically, we're talking about how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. Those organisms with the best adaptations will be the most well-suited for their environment. They will survive and reproduce at higher numbers. They are said to be the most fit. And that's where this idea comes of the concept of survival of the fittest. And basically what we're talking about in that case is survival, meaning being able to reproduce and passing on the adaptations. If you are more fit, you're more likely to pass on your genetic information, and the population will shift over time in your favor because you're reproducing at a higher rate than less fit organisms. So it all builds to this idea here: natural selection. Natural selection is the mechanism that Darwin came up with to explain why evolution occurs, or how evolution occurs. Kind of like Lamarck when he talked about his idea of acquired traits as the mechanism. Natural selection is Darwin's mechanism, and this is the most widely accepted mechanism that powers evolution, that's recognized by the scientific community. Natural selection is the process by which organisms with variations that are most suited for their environment will survive and pass it on to their offspring. So in this case here, nature is kind of doing the selecting by the shaping of the environment through Uniformitarianism, like we talked about, whatever causes the environment to change, where the organisms are living, the nature will apply the selection pressure on the organism. Those organisms that respond best to the environment and the changes in the environment will survive. Those that do not, their populations will dwindle, and the population will shift over time to those organisms that are most fit. And this idea kind of came to Darwin because of something that already existed that was called artificial selection. And humans had already been doing that for thousands of years, in which they picked particular organisms to mate or breed. Like, for example, farmers would breed particular species of livestock with each other, had traits that were desirable. People have been doing it with dogs. They do it with crops to get the best traits in the offspring, passed on from generation to generation. That's called artificial selection, where humans are doing the selection. But in nature, we're talking about natural selection. Nature is doing the choosing. Organisms, populations will shift over time in favor of those traits that are best suited for the environment that the organisms are living in. Here's a couple of examples here. You can see in this picture here which beetle is not going to do very well because it's not blending in with its environment. So over time, that particular line, that variation, will slowly dwindle, and the population will shift more to the greens because they're more likely to survive and pass on their traits to their offspring. So the brown beetle is not literally turning green. The population is just shifting. The variations already existed there. That's what Darwin said. Here's another example with the grasshoppers. You can see different varieties. Some are green, some are brown. The green color is the adaptation because it allows them to blend in, and they can be hidden from their predators. Therefore, they'll survive and pass on those traits to their offspring. The browns stand out. They'll get eaten, and their populations will dwindle over time. You can see the bird here. Very easy to find those brown ones. They stand right out. Who knows, maybe some reason over time the grass turns brown. Maybe something happens in the environment that poisons the grasses. They turn brown, and now all of a sudden it's more beneficial to be brown. Over time, the grasshopper population could shift towards the brown. As long as the variation still exists there, over time you would see a dwindling of the green population. The population is what changes over time. That was Darwin's view, in favor of those organisms that are most fit or best adapted. Of course, the legendary example of the moths, the spotted moths in England. Look at those mice there. One of these ones stands out pretty easily. That's most likely going to get eaten. How about this one down here? Those guys are not going to pass on their genetic information, so their populations are going to go down. Now, there are 3 different types of selections, and remember, this slide is also on the study guide page that Ms. Kelly made for Chapter 16. The 3 types of selection are called directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. In directional selection, what happens is the population slowly shifts over time, as you can see here, in favor of one particular trait. You can see it's shifting to the right over time in favor of one particular trait, and this trait, which is less favorable, the population is slowly disappearing. So one extreme is favored over the other. In stabilizing, the average is favored. So you can see over time, if you look at this one here, over time, the outliers, the extremes, are slowly disappearing in favor of the middle, which is the average. And then in disruptive selection, you have the case in which being average is not good. So over time, the population that was average, like in stabilizing, actually disappears. And to be an extreme on either side here or here as an outlier is more beneficial, and those populations will increase. So make sure you look those over and you know the 3 types, and make sure you can recognize the graph of each. Like if you were to see a graph, you should be able to identify what type of selection it is. And then this all concludes talking about this idea of common descent. And this was kind of based on what Darwin had observed, like, for example, in the Galapagos, this idea of these finches, all these different varieties of finches, so different but so similar. The tortoises as well, so similar but so different. So he proposed this idea of descent with modification, where organisms, like, for example, the finches, had a common ancestor finch, maybe on the mainland of South America. And then as they branched out into those different islands, their populations changed over time as those variations led to adaptations. And those adaptations that made them fit better into each one of those different environments, each one of those islands, made them more fit. And slowly over time, the population shifted in favor of those. And this, of course, is supported by the fossil evidence he had, the anecdotal evidence he had, and studying the different species of finches there and the different things that they had that allowed them to occupy their niche within their environment. And so that kind of wraps up section 3. What I want to do now is move into section 4 and talk about the evidence that we have for natural selection. And one of the most important pieces, of course, is the fossil record. Can't really argue with that. These fossils that Darwin found, species looking different but similar at the same time, showing some types of relationships. And remember, fossils are the remains of once living organisms, and you most commonly find them in sedimentary rock. Because sedimentary rock is the rock that least undergoes the most dramatic amount of change, like you would see in igneous or metamorphic. So these are the types of rocks you'll find preserved remains that can be studied, like Darwin did. And past that and move into section 4 now. Evidence for evolution. So this is the last section of the unit. So what were the pieces of evidence that Darwin had? Well, of course, we just mentioned a second ago, we had the fossil record to be able to compare the remains of organisms and study create basically a family tree, studying the relationships and the differences where they branch off. And kind of similar to that was this idea of biogeography. And basically what Darwin did and what scientists do is they study where organisms live now and where they found fossilized remains or similar species that they lived in the past. And what scientists will look at is, how did they change? How were they similar? How did the environment affect them? How did the environment change the population over time as those that were more fit survived and passed on their traits from generation to generation? So this is called biogeography, the study of where organisms live now and where their ancestors lived. And this is a great clue for evolution because you can find these organisms, they look very similar, but they're different because they each occupy a different environment, especially the finches and the tortoises on those different islands in the Galapagos. It's a great piece of evidence. And here's a slide that you can see the evidence here of the different tortoises. Look at those different necks. Look at how different they are depending on the environment that they lived in and what they were eating. Some are much better adapted for their environment than others. But yet at the same time, you can see they sure do look quite similar. Perhaps once upon a time their lines were very closely related, but now their populations have shifted because of where they live. The age of the Earth is another great piece of evidence, which we talked about way back in section 2 there. Remember Hutton and Lyell? The Earth is very old. We now know it's about 4.5 to 5 billion years old. And so that allows for change. There's plenty of time for that. And scientists have been very accurate. They can be pretty accurate with that because they can use things like radioactive dating to establish the age of rocks, fossil remains, that kind of stuff, and put together kind of like a chronological timeline of history. This is a big one here, comparative anatomy and embryology. This is very interesting, okay? Talking about the structures of different organisms, the anatomy, how many different species of organisms have similar structures that maybe they don't function quite the same, but anatomically they're very similar, which is kind of interesting, which puts forth again the argument of common descent, how different species may have changed over time depending on their environment, and so their structures have changed as the population has shifted because of the variations that existed and those adaptations becoming more beneficial. One example are homologous structures. Homologous structures are structures shared by related species that are inherited but have changed over time depending on the environment and where they live. I mean, just look at these 4 structures here, between the frog, the alligator, the chicken, and the horse. Every one of those colored bones are similar bones. They're not the same anymore because they're doing different things. Like, for example, a horse's leg is designed for running. And a frog legs are not really. They're more for jumping and paddling and stuff. But you can see the similar bones. They're similar, but now they're different because they've changed over time. Their populations have shifted in favor of those adaptations that make them more successful in their particular environment. Here's some more examples of some homologous structures, which you can see down there in the left-hand corner. Even the human arm shares similar bones to some of the other organisms mentioned. Then you have analogous structures. Analogous structures are a little different. These structures have a common function, but their structures are different, which means they really weren't necessarily created the same way, but they've become adapted and evolved over time to be similar because they're dealing with the similar type of environment. Like, for example, the wings of a bird and the wings of an insect both are trying to accomplish the task of being able to fly in that environment. So even though they're quite different in their structures, they've evolved quite similarly because they're trying to accomplish the same task. And so those adaptations being passed on to their offspring. So those are analogous structures. Then we also have some examples here you can see of some homologous structures and some analogous structures on the bottom. Another anatomical structure that's very interesting is this idea of vestigial structures. Structures that are inherited from ancestors but seem to have little or any functionality left, but they're still there. Like, for example, this partial pelvis in a whale. Where did that come from? Well, why is it still here? We're getting just a snapshot in history, but who knows? Perhaps over time that will eventually disappear because it's no longer being used. So over generation after generation after generation, it might eventually disappear. So again, these are vestigial structures. So there's three anatomical things scientists can look at: homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures to help put forth the argument of evolution by natural selection. Here's some examples within humans: the coccyx bone, the appendix, some of your wisdom teeth, the muscles around your ears that used to allow the ears to wiggle, all examples of vestigial structures. Perhaps once upon a time had a use, but no longer anymore, or very little. And then the last thing that scientists look at, well, second to last thing, is the embryos. You can look at the embryos of organisms, especially like vertebrates, for example, and look how similar they are as they develop over time. In the beginning, they're very, very similar. Look how similar they look, but then as over time, you can see they start to branch out. That's a pretty big piece of evidence. They're a pretty interesting piece of evidence. And there's no slide for it here, but one of the most recent pieces of evidence that scientists are working with now is DNA and biochemistry, and looking at the chemistry of life and studying the similarities between organisms as well. That's material that Darwin didn't even have access to at the time, but it's part of why evolution by natural selection is called a theory. Remember, theories change over time as more evidence is introduced and acquired to help support or dispute or alter the theory. So who knows what scientists will discover in the future as it relates to natural selection and evolution. That concludes the unit. Don't forget to watch the little video clip at the end. Thank you for watching.
There are four major categories of evidence for evolution: fossil evidence, anatomical evidence, embryological evidence, and biochemical evidence. Let's look at fossil evidence first. Fossils are often used as evidence for evolution. They're the traces or remains of dead organisms that lived long ago. Sedimentary rock contains the most fossils and is formed from mud, sand, silt, and other fine particles. To make a fossil, first the animal needs to die and be quickly buried under the mud or silt so that no other critters will be able to break down the dead animal. Over time, the minerals in the mud and silt will replace the tissue of the animal and will later reveal a mold or cast of the long-dead organism. The law of superposition is that older layers are on the bottom and younger layers of rock are on top. This allows us to relatively figure out the age of different organisms or fossils that we find in layers of rock. So an organism found below another organism would be older than the one on top. So letter Z is older than letter X in this case. Absolute dating places a numerical age range using radiometric dating, luminescence dating, dendrochronology, and amino acid dating. Some scientists prefer not to call it absolute, but chronometric or calendar dating instead, because the word absolute makes it sound much more certain and precise than it really is. It's still an estimation, like the relative dating of rocks based on the law of superposition, but it has a number to it. For example, in dendrochronology, scientists count the rings in a tree to estimate the number of years that have gone by. Differences in growth through the seasons create a ring, and it generally takes 1 year, but there can be some variation. Transitional species are intermediate species, which may be in the fossil record or could be missing from the fossil record. It's proposed that there would be evidence of species that were in the middle evolution steps from one species to another. Archaeopteryx, pictured here, is used to provide a link between the theory that birds evolved from reptiles. Now we're going to start looking at the anatomical evidence for evolution. Homologous structures help scientists find relatedness among species. There are anatomical structures in different species that originated by heredity from a structure in the most recent common ancestor of the species. For example, if you look at the bone structure of a pterodactyl, a bat, and a bird, you'll see some basic similarities. This suggests that they had a common ancestor with a similar forearm structure, perhaps very long ago. But if you look at how they use their forearms for flight, they're very different. The pterodactyl has one long finger that spans a large section of the wing, the bat has a wing between its fingers, and the bird has feathers all along the forearm. These are analogous structures because even though they have closely related functions, they do not have a common ancestor for that function. Each of these species evolved their ability to fly from a different ancestral line. Vestigial structures are another piece of evidence because the structures seem to serve no function, but resemble structures with functional roles in other organisms. An example that's commonly used is the human appendix. The appendix was thought to be a shrunken remain of the cecum that can be found in many kinds of herbivores. The idea is that it's a remnant of evolution yet to be truly removed. In 2013, however, scientists refuted the relationship between cecum size and appendix presence. The appendix is actually a housing complex for mutualistic bacteria that aid in digestion for many species, including humans. Embryology is the study of the development of embryos. The more closely related species would be similar in their earliest stages of development. These exaggerated drawings by Ernst Haeckel were used to show similarities between early stages of an embryo among different species, including salamanders, pigs, and humans. Now, while they're not truly accurate, they were some of the first attempts at using embryology as evidence for evolution. Today, the stages are studied at the same point in their evolution, unlike these images. Lastly, when we read DNA and amino acids to find a quantitative way to organize evolutionary ancestry, we're using a molecular clock. Mutations happen at a steady rate, and the more mutations there are mean a more distant relationship between the species. Fewer mutations means a more recent common ancestor. So, based on the amino acid differences between human hemoglobin and gorilla hemoglobin, gorillas are the closest relative to humans on this list. And lampreys are the furthest. Thanks for watching this episode of Teacher's Pet. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow me on Twitter @SciencePet.